Whether you get an assembled and tested G&S Tire Grinder or a kit, you will also receive a bag full of spare parts, including both sides of the axle bracket, a spare rubber band, spare hardware, some spare thin spacers for the sanding spindle, a 3/32 split pulley and a 3mm split pulley with a square nut installed, 2 spares of each type of split pulley. If the first ones fail, push out the square nut and put it into the new one, and 2 motor pulleys. Same thing. If the first one fails, remove the square nut and install it into this before you put it on the motor. You will need a 1.5mm hex driver for the set screws that are used in the split pulleys, as well as the motor drive pulleys. You'll also want to have a 2.5mm hex driver on hand when it's necessary to make adjustments to the machine or if you need to take the machine apart for repair. Before you can get started, you will need to have your own power supply. You can get something like this, a 0 to 30 volt, 0 to 10 amp adjustable bench power supply for about $60 on Amazon US. Or you can get one of these guys that are about $20 on Amazon. Just make sure if you get one of these that the voltage is variable from 3 to 12 volts or 0 to 12 volts, and that you get the one that has at least a 5 amp output. The listing will usually say whether what the output is, but make sure that when you're buying one of these you have at least 5 amps. They do sell one with 3 amps, which might work okay, but you want a little bit of headroom so that the voltage doesn't drop too much under load. If you don't want to solder or solder wires to the motor terminals and you don't want to use alligator clips or don't have any available, you can use spade connectors. Get some female, either 3mm, 5/32 or 3/16 inch spade connectors, crimp them on the end of your wires, and then just push them onto the terminals. That should work fine for a temporary or non-soldering solution. And then connect the other end to your power supply. When I test the machines I assemble, I just use the alligator clips on the motor terminals. Works just fine. Once you get your power hooked up, again, make sure that the sanding spindle is rotating counterclockwise from this point of view. The next thing we need to do is tram the sanding spindle to the axle bracket. Tramming just means to make sure that they are parallel to one another. To do that, we're going to need some wheels and tires to true. This is a set of aluminum wheels from a slotted car. If you use these rather than an axle from Scalextric or Carrera with plastic wheels, the bushings are already on, you'll need to get some 3/32 bushings to put the axle through, snap it into the carrier. So the first thing we do is go ahead and line the bushings up with the axle bracket and pop them in. Next thing we do is go ahead and get our 3/32 split pulley and put that on the axle. Try to get it in the center and make sure it goes all the way to the center of the pulley before you tighten the set screw. You can tighten the set screw finger tight. The square nut in the pulley will keep it from stripping the plastic. Then you can go ahead and pull the rubber band over the wheels and onto the pulley. And now it all goes together. If your axle doesn't want to stay centered, all you have to do is go ahead and roll that band along the barrel pulley down there so that it's on center. Now we go ahead and move the axle bracket closer to the sanding spindle. Just rotate the indicator knob counterclockwise, raising this side of the axle bracket, and then the wheels will get closer to the sanding spindle. Now you can do this with the machine running or not. I prefer to do it at first without the machine running at all. And I basically keep turning it until I see the wheels touch or almost touch the sanding spindle. Then I back it off just a little bit. And then I turn the machine and try to look right between the sanding spindle and the tires to see how much of a gap there is. If there's no gap on either side, then I need to turn the knob in a little bit more to bring up the wheels. So now you can see it looks like there's about the same amount of gap on both sides. One of the methods I use to test to see if one side is closer than the other is to get a piece of regular printer paper, 20-pound paper, and push it between the tire and the sanding spindle. And you should feel both sides to see how much resistance to pushing and pulling there is. If one side just slips through and the other side does not, then you know the one where the paper slipped through, that side of the spindle needs to move up. Now this process should only need to be done once. It shouldn't need to be done at all if you have a fully assembled and tested machine. However, it is plastic, and it's possible that in shipping or heat fluctuations, things might move around a little bit, so you might need to retram the sanding spindle occasionally. To do that, we would need to remove the caps or the covers or clamps, whatever you want to call them, on both ends of the sanding spindle. For that you need your 2.5mm hex driver to remove the 2 screws on each clamp on each end of the sanding spindle. Once you removed both of the clamps, go ahead and take the rubber band off of the motor and sanding spindle and set that aside. And then to easily move this out of the holder, just push down on the axle carrier. And what you'll see is under each side, just below the bearings, there is a screw. So on the side of the sanding spindle that was further away from the tire than the other side, let's say for example this side was not touching, the tire was not touching the sanding spindle on this side, even when the tire on this side was touching that side of the sanding spindle. We would unscrew this screw. I usually start, because right now it's turned all the way in, so it's not even touching the bearing. So I usually start with 1.5 full turns. The thread pitch on these screws is 0.5 millimeters, so you can calculate it if you want to, but I usually just guess and check. So I'll go ahead and back that out 1 turn and then 1/2 turn. And then what I'll do is go ahead and put the spindle back in place, and then hold it in place with my fingers, and then check to see if the side is closer or not. And once I feel I'm close enough, or as close as I can get it, then I go ahead and put the clamps on both sides. And when you're putting the clamps back on, be sure to start both screws before you tighten either one of them all the way down, and tighten them until you feel resistance for both screws, because you don't want to put too much pressure on the bearing, because that will deform the bearing and cause the sanding spindle not to rotate properly. So just snug these down until the sanding spindle cannot move at all within the bracket. You may need to do that process 2 or 3 times, guessing and checking and making sure before you secure all 4 screws. But once you're satisfied, go ahead and put the band back on, just snap it around, and you're good to hook it back up to power and get going. Now before you start your truing process, you're going to want to get yourself some of the Blue Cap Gorilla Super Glue and a toothpick, and put just a little drop of super glue on the end of the toothpick, and then run that between the tire and the rim, around and around in circles, to spread it as evenly as possible between the tire and the rim on both the outside and the inside of the tire, inside of the wheel. You want to do that on both sides so that the tire is more secure, and if it does end up spinning at high speed while racing or truing, it doesn't flare out on either side. Once you're set up and ready to go, you got your tires glued to the rims, you got the axle in the carrier, you got your split pulley on the axle as close as you can to the center. If there's a spur gear or a crown gear, just try to put the split pulley wherever you can to keep the wheels centered as far as the whole axle is concerned. so that you get as much tire on the sanding spindle on both sides at the same time as you can. Move the pulleys side to side if necessary, or the bands on the pulleys. Make sure that the tires are not touching the sanding spindle, right? So this moves without any resistance other than the motor itself. And then go ahead and turn on your power supply. I usually start out at about 3 volts. So I usually turn the fine adjustment up a little bit, and then I turn the coarse adjustment until I'm close to 3 volts, and then I use the fine adjustment to get it at 3 volts. This is not super important. If 3.1, 3.2, or whatever, it doesn't really matter. With the tires not touching the sanding spindle, pay attention to how many amps. If you have a power supply that shows amps, look at how many amps it's using just spinning freely like this. You want to be able to true the tires to a point where the amp draw is about the same. It'll probably still be a little higher when you're not done and not touching the sanding spindle at all. But when you first get the tires touching the sanding spindle, that'll spike up to about 2.5, 3, or even more amps. You don't want to go too high because you don't want too much pressure on the tire, which can heat it up and cause it to degrade too quickly. So basically what you want to do is watch the amps and also listen to the pitch of the motor. So as soon as the tires touch the sanding spindle, you're going to hear the pitch of the motor go down, and you're going to see the amps on the power supply go up. If you don't have an amp readout, listen closely to the pitch. You hear the pitch go down a little bit? See how the amps spiked up a little bit? That means the tires are touching. Now we don't want them to heat up. Depends on what kind of tires you're truing. I'll go ahead and stop this for a sec. If you're truing urethane tires, for the most part, you can go at a higher voltage and harder pressure, higher amperage and stuff, because they don't degrade like rubber tires do. They don't get soft and ball up and get sticky. Rubber tires, on the other hand, they heat up, they get sticky, they ball up, and you want to avoid that. One way to avoid that, depending on what kind of tire you're using, and of course this is just my recommendations. There's lots of different methods, tire truing methods out there, so try a variety of methods to see what works for you. But I designed this machine so that you can set the pressure with a knob and then temporarily relieve pressure by pushing down on the lever, bringing it away from the sanding spindle. That lets the tires cool down. Once you think they're cool enough, just go ahead and lift up and let them touch the sanding spindle again. You can do that over and over. Just keep an eye on the tires. Turn the power supply off. Check the tires. Make sure they're not sticky. Make sure they're not balling up. And you can actually tell which side is hitting first by which side gets the tire dust, right? A urethane tire is generally going to make gray dust. A rubber tire will make black dust. So this tire is hitting first, but that doesn't mean that the axle is not trammed to the sanding spindle. That just means that tire happened to hit first. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue that process, and eventually you're going to see tire dust on both sides until at least one tire is fully sanded all the way around and all the way across. As soon as one tire is fully sanded all the way around and all the way across, what you're going to want to do is get out your calipers or other measuring device and measure the diameter, the outside diameter. Take multiple measurements to make sure it's consistent and do an average if necessary. It should be consistent, but with rubber, since it's squishy, you got to be careful that you're not applying too much pressure while you're taking the measurement, right? So take multiple measurements and then measure the other tire and see if it's the same or if it's bigger. If it's bigger, then that means that the tramming was not perfectly parallel. So what you can do is take off the axle and flip it around and continue, or you can take off the sanding spindle clamps, and then bring up the side that's too low. Just to try like a half a turn or a quarter turn. It might be all that's necessary. And then continue your sanding until both wheels are sanded all the way across and all the way around, and they have both the same diameter. Now, another sanding method is for tires that are especially soft. For example, slot G25, Revo slot rear tires, NSR tires, tires that are particularly soft and very prone to the overheating and getting sticky and balling up. Another technique that I use, and that some other friends of mine use, is to go ahead and leave the tires touching the sanding spindle, but apply isopropyl alcohol. I have a little pumper of isopropyl alcohol, because isopropyl alcohol evaporates quickly, and it's the evaporation that creates the cooling, the temperature drop. So it evaporates quickly, cooling down the tires quickly, and then when the isopropyl alcohol has evaporated, the tires begin to grind again, and you can watch the amps go up, and you can hear the motor slow down, and then you wait for a second, and then you reapply isopropyl alcohol to both tires, and repeat that until basically the amps don't go up anymore. So I'm going to demonstrate that quickly here. So we're back at about 3 volts. The tires are not touching, so I'm going to go ahead and back this off until they touch. And as soon as they touch, I'm going to use the isopropyl alcohol, and then you're going to hear the motor speed up after I put the alcohol on, and then as the alcohol evaporates, you're going to hear the motor slow down, and you can also watch the amps here on the power supply. Okay, here we go. There we go. Now they're cutting in. I'll go ahead and apply a little bit. A little bit more real quick. And you can also watch the tires. They're going to look wet until they dry out, and you can go ahead and put some more on. And you want to go ahead and let the tires keep going without applying more until they look dry, or you hear the motor slow down a lot, or you see the amp go up a lot. So I'm going to actually back this off a little bit more and put a little bit more pressure on. And you can also see on the sanding spindle little black tread lines. And of course, even when you're doing this method, go ahead and turn it off and double check your tires. Make sure they're not getting sticky, balling up or anything. Looks like I've put too much alcohol on for this particular set of tires, so I'm going to let it go a little bit longer. And when you're using the lever, try not to push down on one side or the other only. Try to push down both sides or right in the center, because it is plastic. If you push down one side all the time, you're going to end up pulling that side away from the other side. Okay, now it's drying out. You can see the amps going up. You can hear the motor slowing down. Go ahead and put some more alcohol on. You hear that? Sped up right away. The amps dropped right away. And we wait. It's doing its work. You can already see the amps starting to go up a little bit. Go ahead and do one more thing of alcohol. And I pump a little more to be at the ready there. Also, if you touch the tire and it's and it slides on your finger and it's still wet. If you touch the other one, or when it's dry, your finger will be pushed away. When it's wet, your finger will slide. So now you can, there we go, the amps have spiked, the motor has slowed down. Let's put some more on. There we go. Now, depending on the temperature of your workspace, the evaporation will happen more quickly or more slowly. Looks like they're starting to get a little bit more even. Amps have spiked. Go ahead and hit those again. And we basically want to keep doing this, hit it with more alcohol until the point where when the alcohol is dried out, the tires are dry and the amps don't spike as much. So it should be more like 2 amps when dry. Because right now we know it's cutting. Because once the alcohol evaporates, the motor slows down, the amps go up. That means it's cutting the tires. I'll let it slow down one more time before I make another adjustment. Yep. Feels like it might be time for another adjustment, but I'm going to go ahead and back it off a little bit and then check the tire quality here. Those are actually starting to look pretty good. You can see the sanding is pretty even on both tires. I might just leave it like this. Or if I want to be super nitpicky, I'll put my reading glasses on and really give the tires a once over. But at this point, I would go ahead and measure the diameter of the tires to make sure they're both the same. And if not, like I mentioned earlier, I would either flip the axle around and continue until the other tire is the same diameter as the first one, or I would do a little bit more tramming work to try to even that out a little bit more. But at that point, you're pretty much done. Depending on the tires, then you might want to oil them or do other treatments to them. But a lot of guys will go ahead and just race them in this condition because they're gonna lose their sheen pretty quickly on the racetrack. Once you're all done chewing your tires, you want to either take a vacuum and vacuum off the dust, or use an air duster and get as much dust off as you can. Keep the machine clean, keep it running well.